All right, welcome back to lecture number 15. This is topic 3.3, taxation without representation. The theme that we're looking at is America in the world, how the colonists are going to be reacting to these imperial policies that the British are placing on them. The learning objective for today is to explain how British colonial policies regarding North America led to the Revolutionary War. The first key concept is kind of long, and it's going to take us a couple slides to get through it, but it says the imperial struggles of the mid-18th century, as well as new British efforts to collect taxes without direct colonial representation or consent and to assert imperial authority in the colonies, began to unite the colonists against perceived and real constraints on their economic activities and political rights. So let's begin here with the representation that the colonists were seeking in Parliament was direct representation. That means that they wanted to elect members of parliament that would directly represent the interests of the people living in the colonies. The parliamentary response to this was that the colonists were already being represented in parliament by virtue of virtual representation. This means that parliament is going to represent the interests of all British subjects, regardless of whether or not they had an opportunity to vote for those members of parliament. In fact, the people that had the ability to vote in England and the rest of the British Empire was much lower than the amount of people that were able to vote for colonial legislatures. So this goes along with the perceived constraints that the colonists felt they had placed on them. They actually were paying lower taxes than people in England were, and they actually had greater opportunities in the colonies to get land and to have their voices represented. But nevertheless, they wanted that direct representation. Now, some of the constraints that were real, that were clearly affecting them, begins with the Proclamation of 1763. This was the line that forbade the colonists from going further west into the territory that was won as a result of the French and Indian War. The Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, and the Stamp Act we talked about in the last lecture, and all of those were instances in which they were being directly affected by these colonial policies. The Stamp Act was heavily boycotted and heavily protested, that eventually it led to its repeal. After the Stamp Act was repealed, in order to save face, the British Parliament passed the Declaratory Act in 1766, which said essentially that we are still Parliament, we still have control over the British Empire, and if we want to in the future, we can pass another tax that's going to affect the colonies and they can't do anything about it. And so in 1767, they passed more of these taxes on paper, glass, and tea, and they were meant to pay for the salaries of the British officials in the colonies. The main reason for this was that they wanted to make the legislatures less powerful over the salaries of these officials, give them more independence, and so therefore the colonies would have less power or less control over their own affairs. Eventually, the Townshend Acts are repealed by Lord North, so the next prime minister, that's Charles Townshend, because there was more impact on the trade that was a result of the boycotts that the colonies were carrying on, and the revenue that was being collected as a result of the Townshend Acts was not enough to really compensate for the loss of that trade. In 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act, and this was not necessarily directed at the colonies, but it did end up affecting the colonies in a good way, actually. So the British East India Company, which was struggling financially, is being bailed out by Parliament, and they are given a monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies. That means that the only tea that the colonists can buy has to come from the British East India Company. And even though that tea has a tax attached to it, it was still cheaper than the tea that was being smuggled from Dutch ships or from French ships. Colonists in Boston are angry over this because they don't care if the price of tea is cheaper. They just, in principle, don't want to pay the tax. And so it leads to the Boston Tea Party. Members of the Sons of Liberty get onto one of these British ships that was being held up at Boston Harbor, and they throw the crates of tea overboard into the sea. It's more likely that the Bostonians who were benefiting from the smuggling of Dutch tea were the ones that were leading this protest, because it wouldn't make sense for the colonists to rebel against the tea tax if it was essentially making the tea that they were drinking a lot cheaper. So Britain is angry over the Boston Tea Party, and they pass the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they become known as the Intolerable Acts, and they are punishing Boston for their part in the destruction of the tea. They close down the port of Boston, and they say that they won't reopen it until the tea has been paid for. And obviously, the colonists are indignant. They are not going to pay for that tea. Independently of the Coercive Acts, Parliament passes the Quebec Act, which is going to organize the rest of the Quebec territory. This is French Canada. And it's going to extend the boundary for Quebec down to the Ohio River Valley. And it's also going to establish Catholicism as the official religion in that territory. So that's going to anger the colonists in two different ways. The first is that they don't like Catholicism. Remember that the colonies have a very strong Protestant background. And the second is that they felt that the Quebec territory that the French settlers were living in were being awarded the land that the colonists had fought for in the French and Indian War. The colonies of Virginia and New York and Pennsylvania, they had claims to that land that was being given away. And then lastly, we have Lord Dunmore's proclamation. Lord Dunmore was a British official in Virginia, and as Virginia was starting to become more antagonistic to British rule, he tries to maintain martial law by promising the emancipation for any enslaved person who was willing to join the British Army and put down an uprising. And so that really angered the people in Virginia because slavery had played such a large part in their economy. And then here's a larger map showing the effects of the Quebec Act. As you can see, the area here in the Midwest becomes Quebec, the territory of Quebec, and then everything below the Ohio River Valley, according to the Proclamation of 1763, had become Indian Reserve, and it was really limiting the expansion of those colonies. Moving on to the basis for the colonial resistance, we had colonial leaders that based their calls for resistance to Britain on arguments about the rights of British subjects, the rights of the individual, local traditions of self-rule, and the ideas of the Enlightenment. So these arguments against direct and indirect taxation on the colonies were based on all of these, especially self-rule and the Enlightenment. These were vocalized in many different pamphlets, the most famous of which at this time was the letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania by John Dickinson, arguing mostly about the concept of taxation without representation. There was also the Massachusetts Circular Letter, which was written by the Massachusetts Colonial Legislature with Sam Adams and James Otis calling for other legislatures to petition for Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. And that's what's going to lead to the troops being sent to Boston Harbor. On the bottom right, you see a sketch of what it looked like when the British troops came in, and this was done by Paul Revere. So the contributors to the independence movement, we had the efforts of American independence was energized by colonial leaders such as Benjamin Franklin, as well as by popular movements that included the political activism of laborers, artisans, and women. To begin with Benjamin Franklin, you see the political cartoon on the top right. This was drawn as a way to protest the Stamp Act. You can see that the colonies are being depicted as having lost their limbs as a result of this tax. So it's being very dramatic about what the Stamp Act is going to mean for the colonies. Remember, Benjamin Franklin was a printer. He published his Poor Richard's Almanac every year, and so if the Stamp Act was put in place, then he would end up having to pay for a lot of this tax as a publisher. So obviously it's going to affect him greatly. There was also an attempt at calling for a wider boycott of the Stamp Act that was seen in the Stamp Act Congress, and then the activities of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. They would sign non-importation agreements and boycotts of British goods. Spinning bees by colonial women were meant to create textiles here in the colony so that they wouldn't have to purchase it from England. And the economic impact of these boycotts and non-importation agreements were strong enough to have Parliament repeal the Stamp Act. Later on, when the Townshend Acts are passed, more colonial resistance comes about, similar to the ones that was seen during the Stamp Act resistance. So we have non-importation agreements again. And in Boston, this escalates into the Boston Massacre. You had some Sons of Liberty harassing British troops in March of 1770. And they end up retaliating. The British troops end up retaliating against the colonists that were harassing them. This leads to the killing of some of the colonists, and Crispus Attucks, who is normally seen as the first casualty of the independence movement, was one such casualty. So he was of mixed African and Indian descent. We do see some unruly behavior from Sons of Liberty as part of this resistance. So they would tar and feather tax collectors, and obviously the Boston Tea Party was destroying private property that never ended up getting paid for. And then our next key concept says, in the face of economic shortages and the British military occupation of some regions, men and women mobilized in large numbers to provide financial and material support to the Patriot movement. So here's where we want to focus on women a little bit more, because the non-importation agreements and the boycotts disproportionately affected them, because all of the finished goods that were coming from England now had to be replaced by manufactured goods from home. So women had to now spend extra time on top of their other duties creating the goods that they could not purchase from England in order to maintain loyalty to this resistance movement. Smugglers had the incentive to get imperial policies repealed. John Hancock in Boston had been known for his smuggling and his resistance to these British imperial policies. All right, and then finally a recap. The colonists begin to unite over British imperial policies. The colonial resistance was based on ideas of the Enlightenment and self-government tradition, and resistance to British policies came from diverse groups: rich, poor, women, men. All different groups supported these policies, but as we'll see later on, there's also going to be a group of colonists who are going to remain loyal to the British Empire. All right, so that's it for today, and I'll see you on the next lecture.